if you're talking about the way intelligence is gathered, by the way the agencies do it, it's now become far easier for the agencies to gather and analyze information as opposed to say 50 years back in 1971.
Teamwork Arts Podcast, ladies and gentlemen. This is where we try and go behind the thoughts that animate the actions of those who create the arts. And today, a man who has told us a story that for a very long time was not supposed to be told, but when it did come out, it made our heart swell with pride a little. I remember having had these conversations with you on the stair of this mutual office that we used to share at one point in time, and I could literally see the sparkle of excitement in your eyes about Operation X.
That's correct.
It's a suitably cool name to give an operation.
Well, it's actually the full form of that operation. It's very boring military jargon. Is Naval Commando Operations X, which we had to condense to Operation X for the purpose of the book. But that's what it was called, NCOX.
I see.
And it's a very mundane sounding title for something that was as exciting as what I told you way back then, so many years ago.
Yes.
And that excitement came out of the fact that this is a story that I'd been following for almost over 20 years. And when I finally caught up with it, it was like, my goodness. What am I going to do after this? After I write this book, there are no more stories to tell. It was almost like that. That's how exciting.
Sort of like a definitive war story, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's actually a war story with a twist, because it's not like a war story. It has military operations. There is that element of, action and danger and, going into enemy territory and all of that. But the principal characters of this are basically plotters. They are the guys who ideate. They are the guys who get the, training going and the wherewithal, improvisation, planning, and finally the execution is entirely done by the Bengali civilians that they are trained as naval commandos. So it's a very unique kind of Indo-Bangladesh joint operation, if you will, and where the Indian Navy, personnel who were doing all the training and the ideation and all, they were literally the backroom boys, if you can call them that.
Right.
But the front end was these, naval commando fighters, incredibly brave men, who literally risk life, limb, the safety of their families and their friends and collaborators and all, the whole thing that, goes with fighting a guerrilla war. When a guerrilla fights, he puts his life in danger and also those of his family members who can be, picked up and tortured and all. It's a very remarkable kind of story. And what a remarkable time that was in 1971.
Absolutely.
It's like a textbook kind of thing, Sarthak. We've all spoken about this in the past, how the Indian Armed Forces carried out this very textbook operation to go in and liberate the East Pakistan, give it independence, call it Bangladesh, and that was a moment that kind of repudiated Jinnah's two-nation theory, the fact that Muslims could live together in one country, and which completely, neglected the fact that there was something like culture, which is far more of a binding factor than religion. And that's the reason that this cultural imperialism that the West Pakistanis sought to impose on their Eastern citizens is what backfired on them. And that's what led to the creation of Bangladesh. And in fact, this book is just one of those hundreds of stories of remarkable, courage and fortitude.
Absolutely. But I think the most interesting part about the book was the fact that it told the story of that much vilified of the armed forces arms, which is the thinkers, the people who sit in the offices working out the details. Because far too often we've seen the belligerence of on-ground fighting, showing the thinkers as the subservients who are not really out there. But this operation was actually about thinking and strategy and sitting down and spending the hours to try and figure out things.
Absolutely. And Sarthak, you've hit the nail on the head, because intelligence gathering and analysis and all is a very boring activity. It doesn't translate well on screen, and that's the reason you have James Bond. There are no real life James Bonds. There are very few of them actually, because the bulk of the intelligence gathering and collecting is a very boring activity. You know, it doesn't, like I said, it doesn't translate well on screen. And you have in Operation X, you have this very large group of, actually a small group of very committed naval officers who sit there and analyze and strategize and plan and, do the targeting and, the planning and the training and all of that, which is really more than half of that work, that for a successful mission, it's not only about getting those boots on the ground, but it's also the logistic backup, the arming, the equipping, the training, and the intelligence. That the fact that you should know which merchant ship is coming into East Pakistan, what it's carrying, what its cargo is. Is it cargo that you should be targeting, or is it something like sand, for instance, which, you might as well ignore and, focus on priorities like arms, ammunition, and, fuel and food, for instance. And that's what these men in Operation X did. They targeted this merchant shipping that was flowing into East Pakistan.
You as a journalist also have had your Operation X's galore through your career. Focusing on the cloak and dagger, so to speak, of the whole establishment, etc. Have you seen a change in the way when you started to now, in the way information is gathered? More importantly, and probably more strategically, the way it is interpreted now.
Right.
Have you seen a change happen through your?
Well, absolutely. If you're talking about the way intelligence is gathered, by the way the agencies do it, it's now become far easier for the agencies to gather and analyze information as opposed to say 50 years back in 1971. Today, you have civilians who've actually turned into intelligence analysts because of the range of tools that are available at their disposal. And you only have to look at the footage that's coming out of the Ukraine war, where you have citizens actually sitting and poring over satellite data and, interpreting satellite data, studying the movement and patterns of air traffic, identifying military aircraft that is moving around. So it's, in a sense, you can imagine what it must be like for the intelligence agencies. It's like a bonanza. It's an electronic bonanza in terms of the kind of radio traffic that's being generated. For instance, they're able to pinpoint, which formation is moving where and all that.
Also, I think the very definition of public domain seems to have changed from the time that you started.
Absolutely. So, I mean, if you're looking 50 years back, you and me, if we were back in 1971, we would have had very few tools at our disposal to actually understand what was going on in the world outside. I mean, we just had transistor radios for the news. We had newspapers, and you had a TV channel with like 1 hour or 2 hours of a thing a day, a broadcast a day. So you're living in a kind of a closeted world where information was very hard to come by. And today it's exactly the opposite. If you had the fog of war then, you have a saturation of information today. In 50 years later, where you're actually flooded by images and visuals and data. And for you to gather, to sift through that is a far bigger challenge than it was in the past.
And in fact, that leads me to my favorite question that I've been asking a lot of people who've been writing as well. Information now is increasingly masquerading as knowledge because information is passive. You have information everywhere.
Yes.
Knowledge is actually the active gathering of information.
Right.
But a lot of information is now being passed off as knowledge.
Knowledge. Exactly.
Is that, do you think, a threat to the profession that you've chosen for yourself and to the subject of that profession?
Yeah. So it's actually, as you rightly put it, I mean, knowledge is masquerading, information is masquerading as knowledge. And I think the distinguishing factor in a lot of platforms, in media, for instance, where I work, is going to be your ability to cut through the clutter and discern this knowledge from information and tell this to the people the way it should be told, and tell stories in such an environment where you don't kind of as we say, write for your sources. You explain to the common man, and I think that's increasingly becoming the case because as news organizations, you were used to a certain kind of that closeted information space that we mentioned, and today you're now open to the rest of the world. The world of information has become flat. So you have your reader today who's consuming the New York Times at the same time that he's reading the Times of India, for instance. So for you to say that, look, oh, that's like, it's a foreign brand and it's got so many more resources and all that. It's not going to cut much ice with the reader, because he expects the same quality out of you that he does from the New York Times. So it's a far more challenging time for us in the media space, and that's the challenge for us to reinvent ourselves.
And I think that's the thing about democratization of information. No?
Yes.
It's just open. But also, information knowledge also depend largely on questions.
Yes.
Because there are no wrong questions. There are only probably wrong answers.
No wrong answers, exactly.
But questions are now, of course, also, in a sense, for lack of a better way of explaining it, being weaponized.
Yeah.
Also being thwarted quite actively, because sometimes asking a question becomes an act of rebellion in itself. You in the field of defense, probably even more so.
Absolutely.
Do you think the importance of the question endures, or do you think that again is a bit of a concern?
Absolutely. And one reason this book actually turned out the way it did was the fact that I kept asking a lot of questions. Yeah. And my first question was 25 years back, when I happened to read Admiral Roy's book on the 1971 war, where he alluded to the fact that there were all these operations. And my first question is, exactly what Henry Kissinger asked in the White House. Who's training these guys to do all this stuff, to blow up ships and, plant mines? I mean, this is the kind of training that of a very high order, which is not available to civilians. And here you have civilian college kids who are running around with limpet mines and anti-ship mines and all that, So, hey, who's training them? That's the first question to ask. And that's when I actually, that was the thread that I started pulling, and I kept pulling it, and lo and behold, there was this wide, big, wonderful world of Naval Commando Operations X, which is the case with a lot of other things as well, where you ask the kind of questions and that will lead you to a certain set of answers.
But is it getting difficult to ask questions?
It's becoming increasingly difficult to ask questions, primarily in the military space, because information is very hard to come by because of the fact that information warfare has become such an important part of military operations today. And everybody is weaponizing information. For instance, if you have to see the way India and Pakistan, for instance, play it out. Or for that matter, India and China, the way information is weaponized by the Chinese, they would come and they'd plant flags on Galwan, for instance, and they'd play it out like saying that this is the flag that flew in Tiananmen Square and now it's flying in Galwan. So it's like it's that video, which is, bombarding social media, is like, the objective is to grab the moral high ground to say that, look, we are bigger than you, and we've captured Galwan and you're nowhere. And so they have weaponized information in a way that we can't aspire to even, It's because at the end of the day, we are like a democracy, and we are answerable to the people, whether you like it or no. You cannot hide casualties, for instance. That's a simple, basic fact of life in India, is that you cannot have a Kargil operation and hide the losses of all your men that the Pakistanis did for a decade plus. We still don't know how many Chinese soldiers, for instance, died in Galwan. There are conflicting reports of, they're saying, between 5 and 50 and 100 who died there. Sure. And these would not be known simply because of the nature of those governments. You have a military dictatorship in Pakistan, and you have a communist party dictatorship in China. Sure. So here you have within its confines, the Indian state, within the confines of a democracy, trying to kind of, work its way around, releasing information to the media on a need-to-know basis.
Sure.
And so I was saying that the point being that it's becoming increasingly difficult to access information, because the government has kind of started tightening restrictions on, for instance, former personnel speaking about operations that they've been part of, which is well and good, because I can see from their point of view that they don't want operations to be compromised. This whole thing of rushing to the media almost as soon as you've done it, and say that, look, I did it, I was there, and like exactly like you had those special forces operators in the US doing it. The US also has a problem with that, as do we. And unfortunately, there's no selective grading of information that's to be released to the public here.
Sure.
Everything is classified. And it's so ridiculous that this Official Secrets Act, which is the declassification policy under that, which tells you the policy that is supposed to apply to military documents and all that. There is a declassification policy.
Right.
That policy itself is classified. I mean, that's how funny things are.
Very Orwellian,
yes,
actually.
It's very Orwellian. Yeah. So, how do you declassify papers? We have a declassification policy. Can I see the declassification policy? It's classified. So, this is so. It's very difficult to make sense of operations like this, and it's just pure coincidence. This book, for instance, coming back to Operation X, it's pure coincidence that I happened to run into Captain Samant. Who was a very key figure in this operation.
Right.
He passed away a few years back, and it just so happened that he wanted to tell his story. It was to be his autobiography.
Sure.
And when I saw what he had, the kind of research material that he had been working on and who he was in 71,
Right.
I instantly figured, look, this is not a normal autobiography. This is a story of a military operation that's never been told before.
Absolutely.
And it's just happenstance that I ran into him. And I'm not sure of how many other such operations have actually been lost for posterity, because of the fact that, the principal actors are no longer with us.
Sure, that's the past. But for the future, those who would want to follow in your footsteps in the field of journalism and in the field of authorship, what would your advice be to them?
My advice to you would be to find a field of your specialization and persist and ask questions, do a lot of research, go for the primary sources, go not only to the people who would have taken part in such operations or who've been part of a certain organization, but go to the primary sources exactly as any other research scholar would do across the world. Go to the libraries, go to newspapers and start gathering that intel. The internet is a fantastic tool. I mean, it's a research tool, but don't rely on just internet research. Go down to your libraries. A lot of stuff is not being kind of digitized. Go to those original sources, get those documents, spend time, do research, do some hard work, come out with original stories. Don't repeat what's already out there, what everyone knows. Go for the story.
Go for the story. Do the hard work. Yeah, take that away, if you will, from this wonderful conversation with the redoubtable Mr. Sandeep Unnithan. The book is called Operation X. You might want to read it. And of course, if you can take away something from this podcast that will hopefully make you think, that will be a good first step. Sandeep, thank you very much. As usual, it's been a delightful conversation with you, which I've had the pleasure of having many times over. But for the listener, it should be enlightening.
Thank you. Thanks, Sarthak. Always good to chat with you, my friend.
That's the Teamwork Art podcast, ladies and gentlemen. You've got anything to say to us, please feel free. The comment section is open. Do follow us, like, subscribe. You know what to do. And what's coming next? Well, for that, you'll have to do all of that. No? Like, subscribe, etc. This is the Teamwork Arts podcast. Thank you very much for listening.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, subscribe to our channel now. We have a new episode out every Friday.